I notice that I feel this way too. I sense a sense of urgency to communicate what your life, what you've been working on all your life, and your philosophy and your ideas.
I think when you're trying to get to know someone, maybe you're in love with someone and you try to express what it's like to be you or how you feel about them, it always feels like there's something that's incommunicable about that. If I try to describe to you my experience of standing before a painting, certainly I can get some of that across, but I can never get across exactly what that experience is like. And there's this idiotic dimension to it in that regard. But I think that you really get at the idiotic dimension when you realize that the people that you're closest to and yourself, there's this uncanny strangeness that's never fully dispellable about them.
I think there's a creative tension in that. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. It's our fragility that makes us vulnerable to abuse and to betrayal, to lies, to alternative facts or fake news or whatever it is that you're going to have that can frustrate, thwart, distort our very being.
He's just going along being Forrest, right? And he's changing the world. And he doesn't even know he's changing the world.
The face of the idiot can be the face of deep wisdom, the holy fool. It's in many other traditions also. That's in my mind too, when I talk about the idiot.
Yeah.
Or the fool, for instance, in King Lear. The fool in King Lear is probably the wisest person in the whole play. The idiot who actually shows a deeper spiritual freedom by being able to see things truly and without illusion.
I was dancing and I was just looking up at the stars and like completely at one with the music, like everybody. And then it caught my eye that the sun had just started to dawn, right?
Thank you so much for tuning in to Circling Dialogos. If you are inspired by what we talk about on this channel and want to dive deeper and in fellowship with others, there's a number of ways you can do that. One is to become my client and work one-on-one with me. We also have circling events every week open to the public. We also do weekend intensives for circling every 4 to 6 weeks or so. And we have a year-long Art of Circling practitioner training program. We also have self-study programs that you can do at your own pace. All the relevant links, including my email, is below in the show notes. Please let me know if you have any questions.
Sounds terrific.
Yeah. That sounds terrific. I'm just going to, because I always forget about this, but I'm just going to record everything and I'll edit stuff out if need be. Let's see. Find the record button. Where are we? Oh, I am recording. Okay, good. I did remember. See, I keep demonstrating the topic. I am going to, listen, I just want to say in advance, my humor Tourette's syndrome undiagnosed. I'm going to refrain from all the idiocy jokes that pop in my mind. And if I slip, I want it to be appreciated how many I'm not saying.
Yeah.
So thank you for all being here. I've had individual conversations with each of you. Yesterday, Ryan and I just had an amazing conversation. I think we probably didn't sleep much last night. We were so pumped afterwards. And Stephen, we had a conversation a few months ago, I think, on your book about Desmond, which I thought was really wonderful. And William, we had the pleasure of speaking, I think just like last week or the week before, if I'm not correct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just last week, yes. Yeah, last Thursday, I think. Was it last Thursday?
Yeah, I think
was it Thursday week?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, maybe Thursday week, was it?
Totally, yeah.
No, it was last week, I think. Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
And
I think there's, given that Ryan and Stephen have written books about your work, I notice that I feel this way too. I sense a sense of urgency to communicate what your life, what you've been working on all your life, and your philosophy and your ideas. There's a sense, I think Ryan and I were talking about yesterday, that it feels like your work has your finger on the matter of matters in some sense, right? That's pressing in our time in particular, but also something, you're also pressing into perennial notions and problems in a certain sense. I think, as especially as you speak of and distinguish a default atheism, right? In some way, I would say that the listening of the people who listen to this channel, in some respect, are like all in their own way confronting this
yeah,
through thinking about it, through different kinds of religious practices and spiritual practices. And there's a whole thing called roughly, I think this is part of what they call this little corner of the internet. It's not super organized or anything. It's just a motley of people who are inclined to think deeply, but also are taking up, right, what it is to be, what it is to live, right, what it is to be in the world, in given everything, and especially specifically given the meaning crisis and the default atheism and the nihilism that I think that we're all so front and center right now. So I would say, I just want to start off by just saying, I think that there's a common spirit, right, for which we are speaking from and who we are speaking to, just to presence the kind of listening, if you will, of this channel and what we're doing. Yeah. So I just want to, anything anyone want to say to that before we get started with the notion of idiocy?
well, could when you were talking about urgency, especially in some of the earlier books that I wrote, I used to talk about, and I'm not disowning the notion, connecting religion, being religious, with what I call the urgency of ultimacy. So that sense of ultimate questions, but coupled with a sense of urgency. But my sense was that our own time, in the West at least, in any case, first of all, there's in academic philosophical circles, there's a kind of a defection from questions of ultimacy. Those big questions are supposedly overcome in a post-metaphysical time. And hence there's a kind of flattening of the terrain of thinking to an immanence that isn't concerned with ultimate questions. But the notion of urgency is very interesting also, because urgency is not something in the first instance that is a matter of rational self-determination. You're impelled towards something. But I think in French, urgence connotes what we in English will talk about as emergency services, an ambulance, that there's something not quite in balance, or there's something that needs to be dealt with, and it can't just simply be postponed.
Yeah.
And even the word emergency carries that connotations of something emerging.
Yeah.
I think that the ultimate questions they emerge in us unbidden. We don't have a choice if we let if you like, the eros of human restlessness and seeking to know and seeking to be good, if we let them emerge, that sense of that urgency of ultimacy. It's a kind of revision of Paul Tillich, very thoughtfully defined religion back in his own day as everyone has an ultimate concern.
Yeah.
And even if it's not named as God, it could be money, it could be sexual conquest, it could be recognition and honor in your job, and so on. So many different things actually are there that can try to fill this ultimate concern. And of course, it's a very old question. The finite things don't answer to the ultimate concern. So the urgency of ultimacy, but I wanted to get more of that urgency into it. And but I won't go on too much longer about it. But as I thought about things more, urgency of ultimacy is more forward-looking. I thought we also needed to swivel backwards, so to say, not just be directed as it were, towards an end, but also a return into the more original sources out of which the urgency comes to emergence. And that's when I began to think about the passio essendi, the patience of being, and the porosity of being. And I see them as the thing about the urgency of ultimacy. You can say, I'll take care of my own unfolding. I'll determine its shape. And again, put myself in the master's seat, so to say. But with this patience of being, with this porosity of being, there's a prior openness that is required to even shape the proper receptivity of that search for ultimacy.
Mm.
And so I think that in some of the later writings, if that's the right word, the balance between the return into this becoming porous again, plus the energy, the transformation of the conatus essendi, actually, the endeavor to be is transformed, I think, by a deeper inhabitation or a deeper receptivity of this more receiving side of our own being. So these are some of the kind of complications but I think the return into more original sources has much to do also with the sense of idiocy that is, I understand, to be our
Yeah.
focus in some of the conversation tonight.
Yeah, totally. Totally. There's so much that you just said there that I sense both Ryan and Steve called, so to speak, in a sense, and I did too. However, I want to propose something just in terms of getting our dialogue rolling. So now, I don't want to do the whole practice of this, but just elements of the practice to get started. I want to see what you guys think of this. So there's something that John Vervaeke, Christopher Massi Pietro, and I, and many others have developed it's a practice that we call dialectic into dialogos. And you could say it's basically an attempt to attune to and be attuned by the logos, in that way that Heraclitus talked about the logos as an analogous to the flame, to a fire, right? That the logos isn't something we can just produce, but we can propose things, right? Our propositions, in a certain sense, can start to relate to each other, and a spark can lift. And oftentimes that's when it goes from dialogue to dialogos, right? That sense of things. And just one of the ways that we structure it is it starts off with somebody. In this case, we're talking about idiocy, right? But oftentimes we pick a virtue, and where someone just makes like a proposal. Is playing off the word proposition, but making it more animate in a certain sense, right? Where you say, love is, and what you do is you just start by being as precise, right? And as you can, and articulate as you can, in the shortest amount of words possible, what idiocy is, right? And that's a starting point. And then in the exercise, there's one dedicated Socratic midwife, right? That pairs off with that person in a certain sense. And what they do is then they seek to, I would say, through a combination of something like a combo spirit of Carl Rogers and Socrates, right? Tries to educe, right, the depth of the proposal, right, out of the proposer through asking questions, through pointing things out, like both draw out, but also in some sense, amplify, encourage to amplify through recreating, saying what I heard. And then even things like you could say, as a midwife, right, or a listener, you can say, yeah, I noticed, Desmond, when you were talking about idiocy, you're moving your hands like this. Can you say more about this? What is this? Like things like that, where you evoke
I surrender. Yeah. I surrender.
Yeah, totally. And at the end of that, then someone goes on for maybe 10 minutes, right? 10, 15 minutes or so. And then the person who was Socrates basically pauses, and they say what they really appreciated about the proposal, right? And then they say essentially what may be missing for them, or what's still mysterious about the proposal, right? And anticipate where this proposal may be going, or what's at stake in it, or where is this headed? And then the proposer, or the Socrates, becomes the next person who makes a proposal. Idiocy is, or love is, or whatever it is, right? And then someone else is midwifing them. And you just go around, and at the end, then you just open it up to, you go from more composed jazz to improv. just normal conversation. So I was thinking, like, so maybe we could start with Steve, right? And you can make a you can make a proposal, and then we can all just be the midwives and kind of draw it out and focus for like a few minutes, and then you can go to Ryan, then we go to you, and then maybe we can go to William, and then we can just follow the course of the logos. Does that sound like a good time?
The circle, the square. It's interesting that we're all squares, but we're going to be circulating among ourselves in our squares.
Wow. Interesting geometry there.
The fourfold, you have Heideggerian sympathy, so you should be the fourfold sense of things.
Yes. Thank you.
Is something close to your heart.
Yes. Bless my heart. I feel multiple levels that you're speaking to there. Great. So, Stephen, what is intimacy? Or what? I'm sorry. What is idiocy?
I think you could approach idiocy from several different angles, but one angle I might suggest would link idiocy to what is sayable and what is not sayable about our own singularity, about the depths of our own being, about what's most intimate to us. So one thing that I am drawn to in William's account of idiocy is that he avoids what strikes to me as two extremes that just aren't true to experience. One extreme is a philosophical impatience with idiocy at all. Everything needs to be universal. Everything needs to be objective. Everything needs to be rendered in propositions or shareable, or else it doesn't have value. And then the philosophers that do take our idiotic depths very seriously, they're rare, but some of them are very extreme as well. You think about a figure like Bataille, who basically turns the inner depths into something that is not communicable at all without betrayal. And I feel like the idiotic is, we can always express something about our own singularity, but there are always reserves that we can't express or maybe even aren't known to us.
Can you say more about the inexpressed or not known to us and how that animates or connects to what you're talking about?
Yeah, so I think examples are always a good way to approach this. I think when you're trying to get to know someone, maybe you're in love with someone and you try to express what it's like to be you or how you feel about them, it always feels like there's something that's incommunicable about that. And one of the paradoxes is that often you spill tons of words trying to communicate something that's, you're getting something across, but there's also something that's elusive about it. I think all kinds of dimensions of experience are that way. I think our sensory experiences, especially when we're truly attending to something, are like that as well. If I try to, our aesthetic experiences, if I try to describe to you my experience of standing before a painting, certainly I can get some of that across, but I can never get across exactly what that experience is like. And there's this idiotic dimension to it in that regard.
So you're making a connection between the idiotic dimension is that dimension that try as we may, we can't reduce it right down to our propositions. There's something that always precedes or proceeds or exceeds. And that,
Yeah, because of, sorry.
yeah, that's it.
I was just going to say, yeah, because of its intimacy and its connection to the particular in some ways,
Mm, mm.
the singular.
What's that? Can you say more about the connection between this intimacy and this ineffability? So in some sense, I'm thinking about oftentimes intimacy implies like a real closeness, which implies communication, which implies deeply knowing each other. But I'm sensing that there's a way that idiocy and intimacy is addressing this element that goes maybe beyond what we can say, but also is somehow intimate at the same time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We think that what we're most intimate with is what we're most familiar with. And there's certainly some truth to that. And again, that goes back to one of the things I love about William's account is that it just allows for the common sense that if we've been living with someone for a long time or been friends with someone for a long time, certainly we have learned much about each other. There's been that metaxological exchange and deepening. But I think that you really get at the idiotic dimension when you realize that the people that you're closest to and yourself, there's this uncanny strangeness that's never fully dispellable about them. And that applies to yourself too, right? You can surprise yourself and you can be self-deluded. And another thing I like about William's account of idiocy is that we have these porous steps, right? So William, I love, has a couple places said, been wary of psychoanalysis. In part, you make the psychoanalyst's job a lot harder because there's no sort of mappable interiority. There's no mappable unconsciousness that isn't always porous and fluid.
Yeah, totally. It's unmappability. So I guess we can just summarize with this, and I'll just ask the question. So, Stephen, what is intimacy? I'm not intimacy. It's so interesting. I keep making that mistake. I have verbal dyslexia too, apparently. What is idiocy?
Oh boy. I'll try a sharper definition, and I feel like the more specific I get, the more I risk betraying it. So I stand open to correction. But I would say that one way to talk about it would be what is lost about the particulars of things when you absorb them into a category.
Yeah. What is lost about the particular of things when you absorb them in a category? Yeah. So idiocy is what is lost in that absorption. That would be the idiot.
Yeah, or
Yes.
that's at least shines light on part of it. We're all humans, but each of us have in sort of an idiotic dimension that's just saying, oh, here are 4 humans, fails to attend to.
Yeah. That's great. So Ryan, what do you loosely likes to say? What are you appreciating about what Stephen is distinguishing in his proposal?
I find extraordinarily suggestive this notion of idiocy as what is lost when subsumed under a category, because I think we have such a rage to order and to coordinate things and to lay them out on this Procrustean bed of concepts. And we want the world taped down and disposable at our fingertips. And I think that idiocy militates always against that. And any reductive approach, as Stephen pointing to a psychoanalysis, but we can think of reductive materialisms that would just try to extirpate the uniqueness of the human condition. And I think idiocy is it's a philosophical insight into the resistance of the human individual, the uniqueness of the person that cannot be exhausted. And I think that's one of the things that I've always appreciated about Williams' work, is that you get a sense of the unique singularity that is also in communion and connected to the endowing source of existence and creation itself. But that idiotic it has its own integrity, but it's an integrity that can't be disintegrated by just washing it away. So that's the idea of Stephen's approaches here, just deepen my appreciation for what I have found so captivating about Williams' work.
Is there anything that remains for you unsaid or still mysterious that you want to pick up on in your proposal?
So I think too, we might think about, okay, who are some of the possible inspirations for Williams' account? And I think one that he has noted and sometimes suggested that is not picked up on enough is Augustine. And I think without theorizing it in the ways that William does, Augustine's another sort of earlier thinker in the tradition, I think, who is very good on the sort of strangeness of interiority and of the idiotic dimension and of the extent to which that can be communicated and the extent that it can't, the way that our inner life is porous to experience, but also to the divine, to others, to influence, that's not just closed off. So that's another thing that I think is so important about Williams' philosophy, is that it's so much in conversation with more recent thinkers, but it draws in some very creative ways a recovery from figures like Plato and Augustine in particular would be two that I'd name.
Ryan, what is idiocy?
So idiocy is the unique and unrepeatable event of being made self-aware of itself.
Idiocy is the unique and unrepeatable event of, what was the last part?
Being made aware of itself,
Being made aware.
being aware of the self, the givenness of being.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so idiocy is dynamic, it is unique, it is held in, I think yesterday we used the language from Denis Levertov of being held in the trembling web of being, that it occupies, it has a particular place, a particular time, a particular moment in history, but that it is in somehow in communion with and congress with not only its own proximate neighbors, but also within its history and certainly with its creator. And so that I just, William will write about creativity, and everyone's so like this urge towards being creative, and now these creative people do the same thing. They're so pressured to be unique that they all look alike. And I think that's a betrayal of idiocy. It's a surrender into the category of Heidegger, like Das Man, like the one, just losing oneself, one's voice. What is it? Is Seamus Heaney's poem "The Given Note" about the fiddle player who's alone in his little cottage, and he pulls this air out of the air, the musical air, out of the air, and it's almost unbidden to him, but it's given as a gift. And that music itself, played in that moment, expressed in that way, has its own integrity, its own contribution to make that unrepeatable. And I think that's what's so precious about the fragility of the idiotic self. It can't be taken for granted, but in a Desmondian way, taken as granted. That's where I go.
Taken for granted, but taken as granted. Wow.
Yeah.
And the fragility. So interesting. I'm hearing, tell me if I'm correct, I'm hearing something of a paradox there. Like it, because at one level, idiocy was what I'm saying, you is this kind of as once singular uniqueness that one cannot help but be, in some sense, in the most authentic or originating way is how I'm hearing you. Yet there's a fragility that you mentioned to it. I'm hearing it like I'm hearing two things going on there that seem paradoxical.
I think there's a creative tension in that. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. But it's the cracks it's our porosity that enable us to be in relation with what is other to the self. But that is also what makes us susceptible to being coaxed into being, to being loved into being, to be invited graciously in an ecstasis and outer reaching of the self. The mother or father's loving caress or the loving gaze, the lover's embrace that in a way transmutes the conatus essendi into the kenosis, that I will grasp, no, let me give, that's primary impulse. But that's all predicated on a sense of empowered porosity that allows us to know who the self is. And from that awareness and being empowered can give the self away, give one's own most self in an authentic manner. Yeah. So it's our porosity, it's our fragility that makes us vulnerable to abuse and to betrayal, to lies, to alternative facts or fake news or whatever it is that you're going to have that can frustrate, thwart, distort our very being.
So I'll go next. I sort of pick up on what you said. There's so much I was appreciating about what you talked about. Just this I think most of all is that there's in in what you said, both directly but implied in everything that you said, is this the metaxu, this betweenness. There's a betweenness, right, in a relationality that seems inherent to the notion of idiocy, which I really appreciate that. Because what I want to pick up a little bit on is, first of all, I think my experience of understanding the idiocy, first in William's work and then both of your work where you talk about it in your books, is I got this sense that although I know others William isn't the first person to talk about idiocy philosophically the first one, but I have a sense that there's a way that you brought it philosophically into relief in a way that I'm not familiar of ever encountering before. And that there's something about encountering that with your work where I really feel like it's naming something so profound in this way. Oh God, how come I've never really been able to see this so clearly before? Because there's something so close and obvious about it the whole time, but just undistinct, that quality to it. And then I think I really understand it. And then I go to talk about it. And then I realize, oh, I don't really understand it. It slips out. There's something about, I've noticed, grokking this distinction somehow animates the distinction, right, of the idiocy. There's something about that there. Getting it requires a kind of idiocy, right, in a certain sense. What I want to maybe propose is this. I think the notion of idiocy really draws out what I would call something like the difference between something that I call exposure, being exposed, and vulnerability. And I was thinking about that because the big question for me has been with this is like, what's the difference between idiocy, right, and naivety? Or maybe another question is naivety and innocence. What is that? On one level, they're very related, but on another level, there seems like there's some crucial differences there. And my understanding of exposure, the way I look at it, is exposure has to do with this kind of being exposed to the elements, being opened to the elements involuntarily. There's no volition involved. There's no turning towards the thing that's difficult, right? Or the matter. It's like I find myself, I'm in second grade at recess and they come in behind me, pull my pants down. There I am exposed in front of everyone. Everyone's laughing at me, right? It's just kind of the source of most traumas, right? You end up in therapy for years with those kinds of experiences. Whereas like vulnerability seems to me to be something really distinct in that it has this quality of turning toward, right? When I'm really vulnerable in the positive sense of the word, right? I'm voluntarily, in some sense, opening myself up. There's a turning towards what I'm in relationship with, right? Like in that, it seems something like that. This sense of turning toward relation when something hurts or something beautiful happens, right, ends up impacting me in a very different way than when I'm just like exposed to it, right? And so I sense that there's something deep going on, right, with idiocy that is something like a kind of proactive vulnerability, right, in some sense. There's something voluptuous in its vulnerability that somehow seems to spur relation with others towards them, but in this way that like, it's almost like the idiot and doesn't even need to be aware of. That's another thing I'm wondering about this. It's like, because I think about Forrest Gump, I think is probably a good art image of idiocy. And there's a sense where like, he's just going along being Forrest, right? And he's changing the world and he doesn't even know he's changing the world. And part of him changing the world is part of him not knowing that he's changing the world, right? And there's something that seems to be strangely required about intimacy, like idiocy and its singularity, that it somehow requires a certain kind of unawareness, right? And there's a vulnerability in that unawareness that, whereas if it was naivety, right? It would just open, that unawareness would open me to criticism or chaos or something like that. Whereas in Forrest Gump, it seems to open him and the world, right, to the good in a profound sense of the word.
Guy, what I like about what you're saying is you're touching on there are idiots and there are idiots. They're the idiots. I just went for the Catholic Theological Society of America, and there were sometimes I'm like, this is idiotic. And then there were times I was happily saying, that's idiotic. There's the idiotic of that's obscuring, that's concealing, that doesn't seem to have a grasp on reality,
Yeah.
that just flails about not doing anything. And then there's the idiotic where it's a unique stance or an insight that is profoundly revelatory that starts to make connections that empowers or enables or gives permission for other voices to be represented. And so even the notion of idiocy can be expanded and extended to hit two different poles, what obscures and what reveals, what conceals. And I think it brings out a deeply existential awareness of one's own most self, the idiocy of the liar, the idiocy of the prophet, the deceiver, and the one who is forth-telling and truth-telling all at the same time. But there's vulnerability as the one who conceals, not so much, but certainly with the one who speaks the truth, you're vulnerable. That's a willing vulnerability.
Yeah. Yeah. William,
I'm here
what?
listening like an idiot.
Yes. Speaking of idiot,
Right.
what
What
is idiot?
Jaw-dropping accounts. Though everything that you have said is all extremely rich. Of any hesitation about accepting all of the things that you said. Maybe to come back to Steve a bit at the beginning, this contrast between the public and the private. That's a very modern way of talking about it. Certainly the word private is more privative, really. It's negatively defined, whereas in my own work, certainly I do make reference to the Greek sense of the idiotes, which in one sense is not public, but is nevertheless acknowledged as an essential domain of human existence. Socrates even refers to his own idioting it. How did he survive to be an old man? He says, I idioted it. Somehow it's of course a claim that can be questioned because he's always a nosy Parker involving himself with other people's business, but he seemed to suggest that he kept out of public affairs, meaning dangerous politics, etc. But again, the contrast was presented between kind of concepts as abstractions and something more prior to that. I think that's very important. The way I try to do it, I talk about a certain kind of generality. There are certain abstractions or concepts that are generalities, which even out the singularity of the particular things. And I don't want to get rid of the notion of universality. That's why I try to offer a third possibility in the sense of an intimate universal. But the contrast, that there is something about the idiotic that can't be generalized in that more neutral and abstract sense. And that's one of the reasons I think that poets and artists generally are far more attuned to the idiocy of things and themselves than philosophers have tended to be, because philosophers are always looking for general points of view and arguments that are generally applicable and so on, whereas artists have a finesse for the nuances of particulars. So I would say, again, not to the question of, I thought of idiocy in terms of the idea of intimacy, which was, Guy brought it up and it was brought up by Steve and Ryan also. The certain, again, I'm finding formulations myself now in one sense, a certain primal intimacy, but it can be found in our own self-being. And again, a lot of our discussion focused on that sense of self that doesn't fit into Das Man or, again, the neutral generalities. But there's also, I think, a sense of intimacy, primal intimacy with simply being as given, the that of things, that things are at all. I make a good use of that in the book God in the Between. I talk about the idiocy of being as the first hyperbole. There's something hyperbolic about this, the sheer givenness, the fact that something is and is not nothing. It has an irreducibility about it, but in fact also a certain intimacy to its otherness. So it's not, subjectivity is often the place that we discover something that is on the verge even of subjectivity, this idiocy. But it's also, we experience being as given, including even said nature and its otherness, with this strange intimacy when we genuinely open to the things that show themselves to us. And a third, bringing in Augustine, I think is also very relevant. Augustine talks about, I think there's interior intimo meo, more interior to me. God is more interior to me than my own intimacy. It's a kind of intimacy to a second degree, so to say. We find it very difficult to talk about our own interiority or intimacy, whether as vulnerable or as exposed, and that's a question we can come back to. But there's something not merely in a privative sense about divinity that is even intimate, and in that sense actually idiotic. Because when you try to reduce it to abstract generalities, it somehow vanishes. I think that's a great problem actually with understanding or being religious, that we're looking for an object that we can pin down, or even looking for a self that we can somehow determinately communicate with. But there's something more about divinity that in that moreness doesn't actually vanish simply, but is with us in this idiotic. I think the mystics, for instance, the mystics are the gifted ones. The genuine mystic is gifted with a sense of the idiocy of the divine. I think Augustine had something of that and came to learn of it in the restlessness of the heart. So the notion of the heart also, I think probably the notion of the heart is also a very important notion here. But yeah, I think that vulnerability, just to take up that issue, vulnerability is already a shaping of a more idiotic porosity. At a primal level.
I just want to highlight that. So vulnerability is a shaping of an already porosity.
Original porosity.
Porosity.
And it brings us back to that porosity. Sometimes, or even in the case of the exposure, the example you used of having your pants pulled down, that feeling of being open to the gaze of the other, but in a mocking way, for instance. It touches something so deep in our hearts that can't be generalized again in a neutral modality, that it touches us, that it gets to the heart of flesh, the heart of stone. And we see, and I think we see this especially when we're children, we're much more open to hurt at that level, precisely because the original porosity is more open. It hasn't hardened itself against threats and insinuations and so on. And lovers, again, we were talking about lovers. Lovers also, their porosity is reopened in a manner that makes them most vulnerable also to hurt. From the examples are legion, but if the beloved doesn't look at one in the right way, it's the end of the world. So indicating again something hyperbolic to this idiocy. Okay, not to go on, just one last point. The question of communicability, I think, is very. Ryan mentioned the given note, and it's a beautiful poem actually, and it's a story about a fiddler went into the island. The notion of an island, the island off Ireland is an island off Ireland. He went out on his own into the island, and the music came to him from the air. He received it, and he brings it back to his people. So this, and it comes as if out of nowhere. The musician will not give up his belief that he was given it, again, out of sources that ultimately are sacred sources, let's put it that way. But in being turned into music, there's a communicability of something intimate and idiotic in that sense. So it's, even though there's the kind of derogatory sense of something being idiotic, there is also this always present and accompanying and unnamed intimacy, idiocy. And we experience it often in music. An example, again, from the Jesuit repertoire, Germany Hopkins has a poem, and I think it's called I Wake and Feel the Fell of Dark. But it's one of his dark poems, so the sense of intimacy is very dark. It's, as they call them, the dark sonnets. But he talks about self-yeast of soul, a dull dough sours. Very compact, but and the word that he uses, the taste was me. He tasted himself. And he tasted himself as a sweating self. It's a very, as I say, it's a very dark poem. But that sense of taste, and an example that I've sometimes used to use in class, when I was teaching in Leuven, they have great beers in Belgium, Trappist beers. And you can verify that the idiocy exists because the experience of the taste of the beer is simply intimate and singular, though everyone can taste it. If you're really thirsty and you have that beer and it goes down and hits the spot, we say something like, that's it. We're nevertheless communicating something of the idiocy, and it can't be put into a system, but it can be sung. And it is actually communicated in the kind of, the word idiom that we use, an idiom. An idiom is a particular style of speaking a language. There are idioms in a language. So, strangely enough, the communicable and the intimate they're not at all to be seen as opposite to each other. As philosophers have tended to say, if it's idiotic, we want to have nothing to do with it. We only just have these abstract universals that we can communicate to everyone neutrally. But I think that is actually not true to the best of the philosophers in just talking about the Western tradition. I said somewhere that actually the Western tradition is carried by idiots. Because when you look at the history of philosophy, you have Plato, an idiot, but you have the Platonic school, a variety of different versions of Platonism. But without the idiot of Plato, no Platonism in this larger school sense. Similarly, Aristotle, think of Aquinas, Augustine. So many examples can be used. Nietzsche, something idiotic about, something irreplaceable about a thinker like Nietzsche. But there's so many Nietzscheans then. So Hegel, Heidegger, you can multiply examples, but it's very strange how the practice of philosophy is to turn away from the idiocy towards, again, an abstract universality very often. And in the practice, in my own practice of philosophical thoughtfulness and mindfulness, I'm trying to, in that sense, make porous the space between the aesthetic and the philosophical, and indeed also the religious. And hence, I think in the language that comes out, one gets a sense of that, which some people like. And then there are some people who think this isn't real philosophy, because where is the thesis in the first paragraph of the chapter and so on? That's not how the intimacy of being is communicated.
Yeah.
So that's enough from me. I retract into my idiocy and let you come forward into the between.
Where, yes. Yes.
But just one last, when I was looking, reviewing my mind, many different places where I talk about the idiocy, way back at the beginning of the 90s, I wrote a piece in a book called Beyond Hegel and Dialectic, and it's called Dialectic and Evil. That's chapter 4, I think. Chapter 5, maybe. But it's Dialectic and Evil, and the subtitle is On the Idiocy of the Monstrous. So it's an exploration of evil, but I say that Hegel's dialectical account of evil can't do justice to this idiocy of the monstrous idiocy of that there's something about evil in our evil doing that retracts into an intimacy of being that can't be captured in a system of, in the way Hegel seems to claim to do in his philosophical account. But it's just this monstrous side too that, in one sense, goodness and all goodness and aesthetic beauty and reverence are, if you like, seeded in the intimacy, but also monsters can grow there also. Out of, so if you think, for instance, of the monstrousness of Hitler, that monstrousness was seeded in the intimacy of being at some time in the unfolding of a singular life.
Mm.
So it has a deeply existential side to it in that sense also, but it's a disturbing sense of the mystery of especially the singular human being as choosing its destiny to go towards the light, or perhaps, again, very mysteriously to us, choosing to go deeper into a darkness that turns away from the given source of light.
Hmm.
That's enough for me. I'm a very grateful listener at intelligent conversation,
Yeah.
not at all idiotic.
I really do like this way when you talk about sinking back into your idiocy, right? There's something very rich about that and true about that sense of the listening. Like to listen, to truly listen has a quality of idiocy in a certain sense, right? Like, and so it's certain
It does, yeah.
back, right? Yeah.
I
Stephen,
should say to Ryan, just one little footnote. I was in Maynooth yesterday in St. Patrick's for a PhD, but we went for a drink after dinner in a local pub called The Roost. It was Monday night, very quiet in the pub, in fact, but there were a group of older men playing Irish music. And it's idiotic in one sense, because these were clearly friends that just gathered in not the weekend rush of too much noise and so on. And they were just playing their about three fiddles, guy with a flute, guy with a banjo and so on, just playing Irish music. And so idiocy in the sense that it is not at all the opposite of being together in that modality of intimate friendship, which can take, again, many forms, but you see it in the way musicians play together, something that is, it belongs to none of them, and yet in a certain sense they all belong to the companioning of the music that they're playing together.
Mm.
And it's a passage. It's not like a thesis. It's passing into the music by playing the music. And there's silence after the music, as there was silence before the music. But when it's played, it has the that it is, that what I mentioned earlier, that it is at all, has this glorious mystery to it. And
yeah.
This is the milieu of life at its richest at times.
It seems, would you say, is it fair to say that most of the time we're not in relation or aware of the thatness of the world? We're more in a relationship,
Right.
like in the what it is, right? Especially in the scientific sense, right? What something is or something like that. Usually
That's
the
true.
kind of
That's
main mode.
But I think you were touching on this also earlier. Some people more unself-consciously participate in the energy of being in that more intimate, even idiotic sense. They're not stopped. Hamlet talks about conscience, thus conscience makes cowards of us all. If we think too much on things, we're stopped from moving. And again, that's a question for kinds of thinking that actually, in claiming to understand the energy of life, actually impede the energy of life. And then we see someone who is just full of this energy without being able to offer any rational account for it, but they're living it in a participative way.
Yeah.
And if we lose that, and I think that has to be in good writing and good thinking and good philosophizing and good teaching and good counseling, good conversation and so on when it happens.
So there's this way, what I'm hearing is you're really emphasizing, especially this last part, like when you were talking about being at the pub and they're just gathering, playing music as an idiocy, like a relationality is going on there in a way. Okay? Like that's what I'm hearing is that there's a way, like idiocy can happen in the way that we are together, in the way that we're doing things, in the way that we're seeing things is I think what I'm hearing, which is,
well, that rich sense of idiocy. But again, I suppose you could see if two of the musicians disagreed with each other and they start shouting at each other instead of singing together. So it can erupt into patterns of disruption rather than patterns of mutual flow, so to say. And it'd be interesting to ask about modern music as a kind of dissonant, disharmonious music, how that would relate to the intimacy of being. I tend to think that it's very related to our incarnate selves. The fact that we're bodily beings and our body has a certain integrity for itself.
Yeah.
And we can only hear within certain range. We can't hear everything, and we can only take in certain quanta, so to say.
Yeah.
And there are forms of contemporary music in the 20th century that they're not companions to the body in its given rhythmic
Yeah.
potentialities. We can't listen to that stuff. Again, I know I'll be accused of being a rogue and a kind of deplorable for making comments about modern music, but I'm only trusting my body, and of course, maybe the people who can listen better have better mathematical bodies, but the body is not a mathematical formula. It has structure, and of course, but it's a receptacle of hearing. It's a porosity.
Yeah.
But
Stephen,
okay, I don't want to talk too much because I want to hear what you have to say, especially when it's in a flattering modality.
Stephen, you were noticing how young Desmond looks today. Could you say more about that?
Oh, yeah?
Stephen, what are you noticing? What are you picking up on? What's singing for you?
There are many things. One thing that comes to mind is a story that William's written about and that I've written a bit about and I teach almost every semester. It's James Baldwin's great short story, Sonny's Blues. And I think that's a really fascinating story in that these two brothers struggle to communicate with each other throughout their whole lives. And it's this great reflection, a biblical reflection on sometimes the brother, sometimes the person that you're closest to is the one that you struggle the most to connect with. And who, even though, again, it goes back to the idea that you're intimate with the brother, but they can be a deep mystery. And at the very end of the story, Sonny, who's a jazz musician, gets his brother to come and hear him play. And the music's been a source of division in the abstract. But when he hears Sonny play, it deeply moves the brother. And in a way that helps him deal with the grief that he's been going through in his family life. And so the brother comes, I think, mostly because he wants to sort of make Sonny feel like he's being seen. But what ends up happening is that he doesn't have just a gift to give to Sonny. Sonny has an even bigger gift to give to him through his music. And it gets it this way that music can communicate without words into your idiocy and into the particulars of your life. It's just such a powerful scene in that regard. And I don't, there's all kinds of dangers of oversimplification here. But I feel like some philosophers that are in many ways very suggestive about music, like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, sometimes they lose the idiotic dimension that isn't just a loss of self and something larger, but is that communication into the intimate depths, that clarification, like happens to the brother, where you can see the losses in his life more clearly. Because if you're just losing yourself in the capital W will, or if it's this Dionysian ecstasis that you're totally losing yourself, that might be true to one sort of possibility. But Sonny's Blues brings out something much more complex about that relationship between porosity and your intimate depths and memory and your sense of self. And I think that William's philosophy allows for the Dionysian, but also can attend to those subtler dimensions.
Very. Be interesting to reflect also on the kind of cult of spectacles in our own time, where many people are drawn to a kind of pseudo-liturgical happening where people do the contagion of the crowd, as it were, lifts them up, and they, in a way, lose their sense of individuality. In the way they have their phones, the lights, and so on, and the whole techno spectacle working on the senses and so on. It is a kind of techno-Dionysianism of sorts,
Yeah.
but it partakes of the idiocy of being. It's carried by that.
Yeah.
And it's not always that sense of ineradicable singularity, for me, is something in its own way very precious. Again, Gerald Manley Hopkins, the Jesuit poet, he was a Scotist, and he was very influenced by this notion of hikaitas, hexitas, the thisness of things. And it's reflected in his sense of self, the singular self as somehow the dearest spark of divine fire. But in some of these techno-spectacles, that loss of individuality is sought. And it does raise troubling questions, of course, because in the liturgical spectacles of Nazism, for instance, they produced a very similar effect. And it releases the individual, the singular, from a sense of responsibility, with sometimes disastrous political consequences too. So you can see how what looks like a marginal topic like the idiocy can I would say it probably has something important to show on the kind of cybernetic contagion that's so present in our algorithmic capitalism of the moment. So people find themselves acting in ways for reasons that they don't know, but they have been acted on by the influences and forces outside of individual self-consciousness, and then a crowd is created, a cybernetic crowd and so on, which again, very worrying consequences, as we're all very familiar with today.
Just something there that I want to ask. I'm just so curious, all the things that Ryan's writing down as we're talking. I recently read Han's book about the dissolution of the other in technology, and I thought that was really brilliant. This kind of loss, especially online kinds of things where we've just and I think this has a lot to do with the way that technology uncollapses communication from relation. So basically, and of course, because relation has so much negativity possible, right? If I have a choice, my nervous system is Darwinianly just going to move towards the path of least resistance. And I think we've had 3-4 generations of that now. And I don't know if at the end of it, we've ended up with human beings exactly. At some level, it's something really strange going on there. But is
that the book, Infocracy? INFO, sorry. That's one of Hans' book that I actually brought it with me to Ireland. I don't know how if you say infocracy, you get the kind of F word in there.
Yeah.
It's info, like information.
Yeah.
Like democracy, infocracy. So apologies if people have dirty minds like me, but but it's he's a very finesse thinker, really.
Yeah, very evocative.
And he's got his finger on the pulse of so many currents of contemporary significance for all of us.
Yeah, totally.
Stephen, of course, is a book on him.
Yeah. So one thing I would say about Han is that I do think he offers a really penetrating account of technology and all the malaises that attend to it. But I think he would benefit from a notion like idiocy, because he sometimes is very fuzzy on his picture of what the self involves. Sometimes it seems to be not much of a self at all. At other times, the other is this mysterious depth, right? I think that one would like to see, I think he's hesitant to pin that down. And that's true of many kind of postmodern thinkers, I think. And that's not to detract from him too much. But one thing that he talks a lot about that I think can really be brought into conversation with William's notion of idiocy is this notion of transparency, right? And this critique of how digital life encourages transparency. And at first that seems very counterintuitive, right? Because transparency sounds like a good thing. We want transparency, understandably, from our government, from the police, things like that. But what he means there is something like the digital and social media in particular invite us to just share everything about ourselves, to have no sense of inner reserve. And there's a way in which not only does that often get people into a lot of trouble, but there's this danger. Iris Murdoch says we're the kind of people that make a picture of what humans are like, then become it. I think there's just the danger of just losing the sense of inner depth and richness and just losing your sense. Another thinker I think that's really wonderful on these things is Anne Dufourmentel, a French thinker who died very young.
Yeah.
And she has a book, I think it's called In Defense of Secrets or something like that.
Right.
And there's something provocative and very French about that.
Yeah.
But I think that she's
Totally.
getting, they're both getting at something very important that's related to idiocy and
Yeah.
how the social media and digital really is inimical to cultivating a contemplative depth out of your idiocy.
Yeah. Just remember in, say, Hannah Arendt's book on totalitarianism, the totalitarian regime wants to break into everything private, wants to break down totally any protective border between the political and the intimate. And of course, it wants to colonize the intimate with its own, in fact, abstractions. And I find it interesting, actually, and I had contact with a student from China about, I was talking to him about Hannah Arendt. His name actually was Mao also, but he was telling me that Hannah Arendt is being studied very seriously in China, the origins of totalitarianism, but they're actually reading it as a how-to book. I'm just reporting him, but that it's a kind of reverse engineering.
Yeah.
This is how totalitarianism originated. Let's reverse engineer and see how it can be done in perhaps an improved form. But so the idiocy of the monstrous is always lurking, even in the best of
Yeah.
promising possibilities.
Yeah.
But I don't mean to just dump on the communists, because it's quite clear that capitalism is an absolutely efficient destruction of this deeper sense of intimate selfhood and otherhood, other being.
Yeah.
And I think also in relation to the very givenness of nature, it just turns it into, in Heidegger's word, Bestand, standing reserve. It's just material
Yeah.
denuded of value to be sucked into the system of serviceable disposability in the language that
Yeah.
I use.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
Maybe just one quick follow-up to that is that I think in your conversation with William Guy, you were talking about torture is what tries to expose to the depths.
Mm.
And I think one of the things that Hahn is good on, and here you might see him as updating Foucault in a way, is the idea that in many cases, we are the ones that are turning ourselves inside out willingly on the internet.
Yeah.
And you don't need to torture someone if they're going to do that.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
you have the goods already.
Yeah. Exploiting all of our freedoms. Were we voluntarily exploiting it? Yeah. This strange sense. Yes. Yes. Which of course makes sense to do that if there is no real sense of meeting the other. If communication is no longer communing and you've leveled down most of the negativity of the other's gone, he talks about this, then everyone's the same at some level in some strange way. Yeah. Ryan.
So I want to go back to William's recollection of the Irish musicians at the pub last night, which is always, that's my love language is Irish music. But I would think, whether it's a tiny pub near Milltown or in New York City, wherever, contrast that gathering of individual musicians, each an idiot, who serve a tradition bigger than themselves, that is something that is not necessarily written down, or that it is itself alive and evolving. It's being passed down and takes on new life with every note, every draw of the fiddle slow across the strings. But contrast that to, say, Nuremberg, like a Nuremberg rally, where you get that, where the event of music is used to dissolve people into one mass movement. It's like a degraded, sinister Gelassenheit. It's a releasing from responsibility.
Yeah.
And releasing to do the will of the other in an unthinking and uncritical way. Whereas the servants of mystery, and whether it's a bunch of drunk frat kids singing along to Sweet Caroline, or these wizened Irish musicians who are playing tunes that they learned from their grandfathers, there you have an agapeic Gelassenheit, where you are giving yourself over generatively to subtend and advance that tradition, and where the porosity of your own idiocy, that your unique contribution is preserved and not annulled or defiled
Yeah.
within the living tradition.
Yeah.
And I think there's something very powerful about that, from discordant, degraded abuses of music and the way it can, or social contagion, to the much more concordant, salutary, upbuilding, life-giving. But there plays on the same phenomenon, our porosity, that we are always exposed in a way. It can be empowered vulnerability, or it can be a co-opted vulnerability that has terrible consequence.
When genuine music takes place, or when people are together genuinely, there is a kind of festivity that is at work. And I think when music, the spirit of music takes over, or even if some of the players are turned up to scratch always and so on, you smooth over the kind of jagged edges of those who might not be quite always the best of players. But the there's a joyfulness of festivity. And I'm just wondering about, again, I often feel, and I admit maybe I'm just an old grump, that these spectacles, that there's a kind of a fake festivity. And that often in television shows also, where people are laughing, and you feel as if it's a fake laughter, fake festivity, that it lacks something of this kind of upsurge. For me, festivity is when we participate in a sometimes unpremeditated sense of the goodness of being at all, which is, again, the sense of the goodness of being at all as a kind of idiotic, intimate dimension to it. And it can't be forced. It can be faked. And I we become addicted to them, of course. Fake versions of outrage, fake versions of hatred, fake versions of love. Love is much more difficult to fake, I think, in a strange way, though it can be faked, I think. But it's when music has a certain power to move us, it's been recognized through the ages that it comes from some mysterious source that comes to us, it lifts us up, it can throw us down to, but when we're brought into sadness, we're strangely elevated by experiencing the sadness differently in the music and so on. But the loss of the idiocy would really be a loss of perhaps the deepest, close to the deepest sources of genuine, authentic humanness in our condition.
This is, I'm just recalling, like, I remember what you emphasized in the foreword of Ryan's book that you wrote, was this musical element that Ryan was approaching your work, this singing, right? In this exercise. And I was just really reminded of that in what you were saying.
You mentioned that was the title you put on our discussion last week about singing its other. Yeah, I proposed that again back in Philosophy and Its Others, as I mentioned. And I was trying to think back on the notion of idiocy, and I think if you go back and look at that book, the last section, I think, might be called Idiot Wisdom. I think if I'm not mistaken, the book finishes with Idiot Wisdom. Because I actually do have a distinct memory now of being on a run on a Saturday morning. And the idea came to me is that if one attains something like genuine wisdom, there would be a kind of idiocy too. In a kind of idealistic and Hegelian sense, so the face of the idiot can be the face of deep wisdom. And again, you have there's idiocy that is just idiocy. It's like divine madness. There's divine madness, which is divine. I think it does happen. And there's mad madness. And we have to discriminate between those two, of course, but that sense of idiot wisdom, that there's a wisdom in idiocy, certainly the rationalistic and scientific West has lost the sense of, really, and believes it has therapies of a scientific sort to be able to deal with madness. But that's again, that's a contested question.
Yeah.
The Russians, they have the tradition of the idiot, the holy fool. It's in many other traditions also. That's in my mind too when I talk about the idiot.
Yeah.
Or the fool, for instance, in King Lear. The fool in King Lear is probably the wisest person in the whole play.
Yeah.
And he speaks with this bitter ironies, and Lear knows he's saying the truth. He's being the truthful person. And so there's the idiot and the king, the necessary coupling of a sovereignty that itself goes mad,
Mm.
and the idiot who actually shows a deeper spiritual freedom by being able to see things truly and without illusion.
Mm.
And again, if I'm not mistaken, again, in the Middle Ages, they had that sense of the paradox of power, that political power is bounded by measures on the higher level, divine power, but within human power itself, to have someone who could say things to the king, to bring the king to his senses, literally almost to his senses in a human way, and prevent folly in a bad way taking over in the kingdom. I think it's a very profound way of looking at things myself. I won't make any comments on the current state of the king, and I zip my lip.
There's, speaking of this musicality, right, dimension of idiocy, it has me wonder about, and I've thought a little bit about this, what you guys think about this, is this connection between attunement, being attuned, or the attunement in the Heideggerian sense, like the technological attunement versus, say, like the poetic attunement. This notion of attunement in idiocy, it just feels very resonant in a deep sense. I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts about that.
Ryan, the musician, should surely have some thoughts on this. Sorry for putting you on the spot.
No, it is. Guy and I talked a little bit about this yesterday. So the word resonance here, I know Stephen is a fan as well of Heartless Rosa. And when we think of attunement, it's not finding an identical repetition of a note to what is outside the self. Instead, it's beginning to allow oneself to vibrate sympathetically in that's reflective of the integrity and the identity of the self in relation to the world that is ferosa, uncontrollable, that is and remains other to the self, that has its own integrity, that manifests itself from itself, but it calls us into deeper relationship. And when I sit with students, and maybe we all have this type of experience, where a lot of what I would say is like the world weariness or anxiety or depression that our students, young people, seem to feel is that the world is out of their control, and that's a bad thing, because their notion of being attunement is to be able to lock everything down and have mastery over it. When in actuality, were they willing to allow themselves fall into tune with the world, it wouldn't have to be domesticated under their control, but they'd find themselves as having something to contribute to it and become alive there. So like Irish music is always good for this. If you could take musicians from Sligo, Mayo, Cork, Donegal, and Cleveland, Ohio, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, bring them all together, and within about 40 minutes, the flute players will be breathing more and more similarly in a form, their own breathing rhythm. You will watch the fiddle players' arms, even though they have very different styles, the phrasing is going to come together. No one is surrendered his or her identity, but they're resonating. They're attuned to the moves and styles of everyone around, and everything is augmented for the better because of it. So the music becomes enriched.
Right.
It may 10 people, but now the voices of many others in that tradition are they're becoming truly persons, persona, sounding through.
And so,
Music speaks again.
yeah,
Mm,
no, it's a very important point. Yeah.
mm.
It's just that there's a book by Joseph Pieper, which in the English translation, don't know what the German title of it is, but the English translation says "In Tune with the World," subtitle "A Theory of Festivity," just to link it up to the remarks just a while ago on festivity.
Yeah.
And that's festivity is a kind of a fullness, fulfillment, and in our being attuned to each other in a musical way. And again, I can't get out of my mind the notion of the muses when I hear the word musical in this broader sense, going back to the Greeks. The muses as the daughters of Zeus and Memnosune, the highest gods and memory. And I think in the West, we have lost the significance of deep memory. And it's been substituted now, of course, by cybernetic memory, which is not memory at all in that deeply resonant, souled way that is at stake. Anyway, I don't want to intrude again to silence myself like a good mystic, mewing silence.
There's something also about attunement, what it is, the experience of finding oneself attuned. I'm wondering if this is where some of the sense of idiocy is that I was talking to a friend of mine. I think we were talking about this yesterday, Ryan, like about what is it to teach, right? To teach something that isn't a didactical kind of accumulative linear knowledge. What it is to learn, right? To be open to an attunement, for example, or to be attuned. And there's a real mystery there. And I'm sensing that maybe that mystery has something to do with this notion of, with a kind of idiocy in the sense, and you can hear Heidegger in this, right? In fact, Ryan, I think you mentioned something that was just gave me Heideggerian goosebumps, right? When you said, yeah, Desmond's notion of idiocy is Daseins, or being in the world like on steroids, right? In a certain sense, right? You made all my hyphens vibrate when you said that. But this kind of quality of where, like in my work with circling, there's this interesting learning that happens. There's a skill component of it that you can get better and better at, but there's this fundamental way of being attuned, right? Or dropping into a different mode. And I would say whatever isn't the technological attunement, right? It's more of a being mode or a poetic attunement, right? A Gelassenheit sense. And my friend, who also does similar work that I do, talked about it. Yeah. And here's the process of learning it. It's not slow accumulation. It's, I totally get it. I totally don't get it. I totally get it. I totally don't get it. Right. This quality of that there's something about it that's so total and singular. In when you have it, you're totally in it. You're totally of it. And then when you fall out of it, you're totally out of it. You're at a different attunement. This quality of how we then find ourselves already in an attunement. It's never like this sense of like, all right, there's the attunement up above. I'm getting a little bit closer. Like, all right, a few more inches here. And okay, now I've just hit the border and then it's no, we find ourselves already begun by it in some sense. Okay. Am I hearing this correctly? The through line through all of that is a kind of idiocy, this finding oneself, this kind of totalness of attunement. What do you guys think about that?
So I would just, a thought it's occurring to me. One of what I have always loved, and at the same time can find happily frustrating about William's work, is that, and William, you said this just a bit ago, you don't lay out the typical intro 2 paragraphs, then your thesis paragraph, and then work. Your writing is always an idiotic invitation to undergo, in a narrative passio, a process of thinking that progressively opens one's senses, one attunes the reader to the world, and delivers over a way of interacting with reality in a new, I think, supercharged manner. And I think back to being like, I remember being in the between, having to read the introduction several times before I thought I understood it. But as I read chapter by chapter, categories were being blown open and I saw things anew and in a way that was more deeply metaphysically attuned when I too had read the critiques of metaphysics and the post metaphysicians. And I thought, but that's like what you're kvetching about is not what this guy's doing. William is doing something very interesting, very transformative, transubstantiating in some cases of the imagination and the mind. But what you, what I think is so interesting about William's work is it does have that quality of, it's not just informing you, it really is forming you and attuning you to the overdeterminacy of being. And it does have that capacity to awaken a sense of, arouse, rekindle that sense of astonishment that in so much of philosophy and even theology, I would say, where we find this bloodless prose, William it's an adventure. We're not accustomed to undertaking adventures when we read any longer. We want the summary version. He doesn't do that. It's the Odyssey.
Yeah. Yeah. What's that like to hear, William?
Right. Yes. Well, I just say in guys, and people have said to me,
It looks like you're frozen a little bit for us. Let's wait.
actually, they've had very similar experiences of their reluctance and recalcitrance at the beginning. And am I frozen?
Yeah. Yeah, you're frozen. We got some of it, not all of it, though. I got reluctance and recalcitrant.
Am I still frozen?
Yeah, you're frozen. We can hear you, though.
Can I continue?
Please.
Are you hearing me now? I wasn't on my own screen. But
Yes.
the kind of a certain fluid motion begins to overtake they get into the journey, if you like. And I've had people who said that there was a person who his wife gave him a copy of Being in the Between, and they were driving from Washington to Los Angeles, and this person was trained in scholastic philosophy and theology and so on, and he wasn't as scholastic. But by the time he got to Los Angeles, he had become a kind of Desmondian. I won't give his name, but other people have said they've had similar experiences. But last week, when I was talking to Guy, I mentioned how some people also have said to me, when they hear my voice resonating, they can read more easily. Quite a number of people have said that to me, that if I was giving a set of seminars with God in the Between or something like that, as I did recently, some of the students had been preparing and reading in advance and found it very difficult going. But once I was talking to them, things began to become quite different, and they began to understand, a metanoetic way almost. I think that metaxology and metanoesis are very importantly connected. That a kind of a new mind as meta, an above mind or a with mind, a new way of being with it. The notion, I had with Steve many years ago, we did an interview about religion and art, and I introduced, or I suggested the idea that we're all born to a language, by the mother tongue and so on, with the help of the mother and so on, but poetry is a second birth, as it were. It's being reborn to the language. And I was comparing it to the experience that we have of dawning. If something dawns on you, all the facts in some sense can stay the same, but a new light of a mysterious sort has been shed upon all that was already familiar to you. And with the dawning of this new perspective, the same in one sense is the same, and yet in another sense it's entirely transformed by a kind of illumination. And of course, it's often a kind of a gradual, the dawn is a gradual thing moving across a threshold, but there can be that moment where the threshold is so crossed that one is in a new light. of day. Again, I'm not making any great claims for myself, but just the metaphor itself, it's not imposing something on what's given to immediately kind of mold it into something untrue to what it is, but rather to see it otherwise. And in seeing it otherwise, strangely enough, beginning to see it as it more truly is. And you're not betraying the dawning of light about some. You see, we especially see this in human relations, personal relations. In coming to understand somebody or helping another person to come to understand themselves. It's, to me, that process of dawning is both deeply true to our lives, but also deeply mysterious as to try to find the right words to express what's happening. And I think it's very connected with, at least my understanding of the true poetry, as the second birth, as it were, of language to its own refreshment, being made fresh. It's not, we don't create ex nihilo, so to say, but the creation is refreshed in our wording of it, in the poetic voice. And I suppose analogously, all the other arts too have a kind of a recreational, so to say, power in helping a certain vision of things to dawn for us. But dawn, again, just to come back to the theme of idiocy, I think dawning, if you were to try and write a philosophical treatise on dawning, it wouldn't be easy. I think it could be done, actually. But you'd have to do a lot of thinking to try and make intelligible sense of what dawning is. With examples are very important, I think, about the idiocy also, drawing attention to, look, think of this example. Again, examples are manifestations that somehow concentrate the mind to see something more essential at stake. That to choose a good example is a kind of artistic talent, it seems to me.
William, I want to ask, maybe I can ask you a question. You referred to Plato earlier as idiotic, and in your own way, in the complimentary way, there's an idiocy about God in the. Is there a Sabbath for thought to talk about God, talk about sex in the Victorian drawing room? But even to do metaphysics is, after Heidegger, after Nietzsche, whomever, that there's something in here. It would be the derogatory way of, oh, that's idiotic. I'm wondering. I have two questions. One. Have you found a critic or someone who has pushed back against you that you've said, okay, you get me and you're helping me think of my own, the way that your own philosophical vulnerabilities, but like a critic you take seriously who has helped you understand yourself better? And do you think metaphysics is ceasing to be the dirty word that it once was? And are we seeing maybe a greater openness or willingness, certainly from theologians? I know here we have Stephen, the polymath guy. I think there's an appetite and a growing interest, but like, where do you see a dawning of perhaps a redawn of metaphysics?
I think that certainly, just to take the second question first, I certainly think that there's a new promise of openness. I just call it a promise of openness because the promise has to be realized in some way to get other people then to join in the session of music, so to say. But I think that we've tried so many things in the last couple of centuries, in fact, and they've all been cul-de-sacs. They haven't led to the great new dawning of creativity that has been promised to us. And that's not only in intellectual matters, but in so many other matters also. I especially find this actually with younger people who have not yet been trained into a kind of prudential stupidity. They're still willing to be open to the questions that strike them as idiots, as elemental human beings, as asking for some kind of a response from intellectual life. So I'm very hopeful. The whole rhetoric of overcoming metaphysics and post-metaphysical thinking and so on it's generated nothing. It has generated commentary on commentary and commentary, but in terms of genuinely creative work, I don't see it. I'm open to correction on that particular score.
Yeah.
So I'm very hopeful in that regard. On the first question, I find, I'll put it, use a metaphor like this, up to fairly recently, because of this anti-metaphysical or post-metaphysical currents and so on, people who buy into that, and it's a whole academic institutional framework, they may begin to consider, but I think their antennae are often up, anticipating that if they continue along this line of thinking, then they're going to have to actually return to the basic and ultimate questions of metaphysics and perhaps theology. So the kind of post-Nietzschean sort of atheism has in many instances entered so deeply into the constitution of the professional academic that I compared it once or twice. You have that experience that you're walking on the sidewalk and in the distance, someone that you know, and if you continue along the sidewalk, you're going to have to meet him and you're going to have to start talking. So I had this experience. The guy who's along the road sees me and he doesn't want to talk to me. So he crosses to the other side of the road and walks past me. So I think I have that effect on post-Nietzschean atheists, let's put it that way, that they smell something about God in what I'm writing. They read a couple of pages and they say, they won't be so honest as to say that, but they smell that perhaps if they keep along that road, something like the question of God or the sense of ultimacy, that urgency of ultimacy will have to be addressed. And they don't want to do it. They don't want to do it. It's very strange how the intellectuals can write lectures and hold conferences on Nietzsche's Last Man while exhibiting all the characteristics of the last man. What is, and Nietzsche understood this, I think. What is a star, asks the last man and blinks. Our intellectuals are not dreaming of stars in that way anymore. And they're not blinking either because they've got endowed chairs. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but those who have entered more fully into the type of space that I'm trying to articulate, they tend to be fellow travelers. They don't necessarily agree with everything I'm doing. I think that there's some theologians, for instance, that worry that my sense of strong transcendence is just some old-fashioned dualism between immanence and transcendence. It's not, that's not a way to describe it at all. There are more, I don't know if you could call them pantheistic currents that are becoming widespread in a critique of that sense of the more. I'm theologically actually very at home with a theophanous sense of the cosmos. But if there is a pantheism that doesn't do justice to the more of divinity, I find myself, I'm not a fellow traveler along that particular way. So the balance between the transcendence that ultimately is irreducible and the mysterious communications of signs within the given world of the cosmos that we inhabit, to think those two together, I think, is a very important thing. But again, with some intellectuals, they're seen as mutually exclusive. I don't think that's the case myself. But it's, again, just to round off, strangely enough, theologians or those who are theologically open and nuanced, they are closer to what I'm doing. They're more open and interested than the professional philosophers. Many professional philosophers, they get trained, they get their PhD on the proved subjects, and then they have to publish it and get tenure and so on. And there's something about what I'm doing which is idiotic in that sense of not really fitting in to some more standard ways of doing things. And it's like in the era of creativity, you say that we should celebrate that, but that doesn't actually happen. Often we're more at home with a kind of repetition of the familiar with a small little twist of difference. But it's often just most of the same.
I just would only offer a word of in my deep gratitude to you and your work, and I'm sure Stephen can or would if he wishes to. You enable people to be idiots on their own terms. I love your work because I can bring it into dialogue with Renee Girard and Karl Rahner and Iris Murdoch, but it has helped me find a voice and a way of being attuned to the world that I think is true to my own Jesuit tradition and Catholic theological heritage. but in a way that continues the dialogue and allows us to move forward with new interlocutors and I think that's I will always be a prophet and an evangelist for you to say this needs to be better known because it is so capacitating for bringing people into conversation. And that's what I think it's just in 10, 15 years, like I should hope that it's a much larger, better known approach, because I think it really is, it's the way.
In 10 or 15 years, I'll be idiotic in a different sense. That as old age
Polyvocal.
lays its hand on me. But that's part of trying to live more wisely with age, with getting old, and continuing. I hope to continue to write and communicate as long as I can. And it's a sense, of course, like anyone else, one has a sense of wanting to be appreciated and a sense of the worth of your work. But there's also something about it. You've done something, it's there. It can be taken up as a gift or as something useful. It can be ignored. But again, with doctoral students especially, I never had the idea that I was going to be molding little Desmondians in my image and likeness. I always felt that if there's a promise there, let me be a midwife. This is an image that Guy brought in at the beginning. If there's a promise, and I've had colleagues who will not accept students who are not already well-versed. They don't have the either patience or generosity to see promise that requires also your, if you like, gift of time to the student. But over the long run, of course, I've had quite a lot of doctoral students, and they've been influenced in various ways by things that I've done, not necessarily on the surface of things that they've written and so on, but in other ways that are just as important. But I think a teacher shouldn't just be thinking of his own glory in interacting with students.
Yeah. What else should you be thinking of?
I really think this urgency of ultimacy is you want to see things as truly as possible.
Yeah.
And hoping that one does see things, to say them as fittingly as possible.
Yeah.
Which means often finding a poetic word that there's something about a genuine poetic word in which the meaning and the form of communication, there's no divorce between them. And I think finding the fitting word at some point will find the hearer who is hit, as it were, by the fitting word.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even though, again, it's like sometimes people find my language very strange, but if they have patience, I think a reader has to have patience. And again, in quite a number of instances, people who have given me that patience, the gift of their patience, and they cross a threshold at a certain point, and things begin to hit them things begin to fit together in a fitting way, and some illumination of an unexpected sort comes to them.
Yeah.
And I think if I have had insights, I think I may have said this last week also, that I find the best thoughts, they come to you.
Yeah.
You don't bootstrap yourself up and say,
Like the dawn.
Like the dawn, exactly, yeah. And I think actually that sense of that idiot wisdom, that I can see myself at the end of a 10-mile run, and the phrase came to my mind, idiot wisdom. And I wrote a little essay then, very shortly, trying to make some, or just state what I was stating. But it came to me. And again, Guy, you were asking me about how do you write the stuff and so on, but that aspect of receiving something, often in an unexpected way, where it could be just one word, and the word might contain the whole, even though you haven't worked out the whole yet. But you have this intuition that one word, two words, and you must then be patient and sit down and become a servant of whatever intuition you've been offered.
Yeah.
So I think my best writing comes that way.
Yes. Yes.
And that means when you go back and look at it, then there's a kind of mysteriousness to it that you can't just claim, oh, yes, that's mine and mine only. That type of way of thinking just doesn't seem to be at all appropriate.
Yeah.
There's some diffidence, because I could see somebody saying, look, this Desmond is presenting himself as someone who's been inspired
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
sources from beyond.
Yeah.
But actually, I think in the end, we are all inspired. And I really take seriously the biblical story of the human being becomes a living being. The humus, the mud, becomes a living being because God breathes breath into it, kissing the mud. God kisses the mud in the earthy way that I've tried to describe it, and becomes a living being. And without breath, the breath, even in the living sense, it's life itself. First breath, beginning of life, last breath, passing beyond, and so on. And speaking as breathing in a certain way, singing as breathing in a certain way, communicating with words, wording itself as the breath, taking shape fittingly.
Yeah.
And it's the air that passes into us and passes out again is not ours. We're not possessors of the air.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's very true, I think, of efforts to try and do something. I have so many hesitations about using the word creative, but as a young person, I wanted to do good work.
Yeah.
There's nothing to be ashamed about wanting to do the best work possible that you can do.
Yeah.
And having at times even the sense that this is what I am, this is what I've been put here to do in a certain sense. I really believe that. I have been gifted with certain things, and the gift is not just something to wallow in, but rather it has a promise that requires your own response to it,
Mm.
which can mean a lot of work and a lot of dedication and a lot of sticking with things at times of disappointment or rebuff and so on, the usual slings and arrows of outrageous fortune to become Shakespearean about it.
There's something that this invitation, I heard it as an invitation to really like think dawn, right? And this experience of dawning when you talked about this
Dawn,
like, hit you. Yeah. Like it hit you. It dawned on you. I had an experience.
Something done.
Yeah. Just reminds me, had a really profound experience. It was so simple at one level. When I first moved to San Francisco in my early 20s, I got involved in this kind of outdoor, I don't know, festival rave culture, we'd drive up into the mountains and there'd be DJs and it was amazing, right? It like truly kind of ecstatic kinds of experiences with music. And I remember this one night I was dancing and I was just looking up at the stars and like completely at one with the music, like everybody. And then it caught my eye that the sun had just started to dawn, right?
Yeah.
And it was really interesting because somehow in that moment, I got what it is to be in the dawn, right?
Yeah.
It is this quality of, it's not like this. It's not, the dawn is like a baseball, right? And it throws itself, right? And you watch it, you come up and you catch it. It's more like the dawn somehow throws itself, having you've already been caught by it, and then you get it, like already belonging to it in some sense. And I think that was that sense. And I hear this like in this notion of dawning. I also hear this about insights, right? This kind of notion of like, when we have insights, they're not discoveries, right? In the normal sense of the word, they're recognizing something that was already the case somehow, right?
Yeah.
There's this kind of deep belongingness that seems to go with the insight. Like maybe it's the first time you saw it, but then in seeing it for the first time, you instantly frame back your whole life and see all the places like that was the case, it was just undistinct somehow. This inness, right, of dawning,
Right.
is really striking.
It's the intimacy and the idiocy, the intus in the Latin, the transformation of an innerness that has been opened by Again, not simply itself, but by something mysteriously other that has found its way into that
Yeah.
inner space of our porosity, and we're differently in the world when the dawning happens. But it's not like an empirical investigation where you're going out and determining this fact or this piece of information. It does very much connect with the process of inner transformation, I think. Though it's not merely of innerness, it's of innerness in communication with its own otherness, but also with a certain mysterious otherness in the cosmos. And I think in the religious sense also, the kind of incognito companionship of the divine in all those deep dawnings that are offered to us.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Oh, wow. It's been 2 hours already. That's amazing.
Indeed.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. This has been incredible. I really appreciate it. However,
Well, my thanks also, really my thanks. I very much appreciate your conversation and interest and your illuminations of things I've tried to say, and I see them better when they come back to me from the words of others. So I'm in your debt. I'm in all of your debt, and thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, received. You're totally welcome. Any last words for you, Stephen?
I don't think so. I think we came to a good ending place.
Yeah. Yeah. Any last words for
We,
you?
we were hanging there in the silence.
No, thank you. This was a lot of fun today. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. All right, gentlemen, I will have this edited and get it up pretty soon. I'll send you the links.
Great.
All right.
Great.
Mwah.
Thanks.
Ciao.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Oh, okay. Thank you again.
I notice that I feel this way too. I sense a sense of urgency to communicate what you've been working on all your life, and your philosophy and your ideas.
I think when you're trying to get to know someone, maybe you're in love with someone and you try to express what it's like to be you or how you feel about them, it always feels like there's something that's incommunicable about that. If I try to describe to you my experience of standing before a painting, certainly I can get some of that across, but I can never get across exactly what that experience is like. And there's this idiotic dimension to it in that regard. But I think that you really get at the idiotic dimension when you realize that the people that you're closest to and yourself, there's this uncanny strangeness that's never fully dispellable about them.
I think there's a creative tension in that. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. It's our fragility that makes us vulnerable to abuse and to betrayal, to lies, to alternative facts or fake news or whatever it is that you're going to have that can frustrate, thwart, distort our very being.
He's just going along being Forrest, right? And he's changing the world, and he doesn't even know he's changing the world.
The face of the idiot can be the face of deep wisdom, the holy fool. It's in many other traditions also. That's in my mind too, when I talk about the idiot.
Yeah.
Or the fool, for instance, in King Lear. The fool in King Lear is probably the wisest person in the whole play. The idiot who actually shows a deeper spiritual freedom by being able to see things truly and without illusion.
Man, I was dancing and I was just looking up at the stars and like completely at one with the music, like everybody. And then it caught my eye that the sun had just started to dawn, right?